Hey, welcome back. I know this chapter has been running for a pretty long time. I promise you this is the last video in this chapter. We're going to wrap up this whole thing on architectural shaders, and you don't have to hear me talk about architectural shaders anymore. Okay? So, we can see it. This is the render that I ended up with in the last video. This is great for a preview render because it's only rendering out, so you can see down here, it's 16 seconds, which is pretty fast. But now it's time to do a final render at high quality, and obviously this isn't going to cut it. We've got artifacting all over the place. This thing doesn't look good. So in this video, I'm going to quickly dedicate some time to adjusting the parameters and the quality settings of the shaders and the render settings to get ourselves a pretty nice looking render. Okay, so let's select the walls here, right click, and let's go to Material Attributes. And down here under Ambient Occlusion, well, we can see that the samples are already pretty high. They're set to 128. And 128 is a pretty high sample setting, but in this case, because the walls do encompass the whole scene and their distance is set to a pretty far amount, 150 units, I'm going to have to use samples of 128 to render this out at even decent quality. Okay, so let me select the floor in the viewport here, go to its material attributes, and the floor is using 16 samples for its ambient occlusion feature. So let's actually increase that to about 32. Will probably work out pretty well. Let's close that. Let's actually close the render view. Let's go to the counter material here, the white counter material. Let's increase those samples up to about 32. It's probably going to look pretty good. Actually, let me increase that to 64 just to be on the safe side there. Okay, let me actually zoom in here, check out any objects. I believe this teapot over here is using ambient occlusion, so let's go to 32. 32 will work out just fine for that. I'm not really sure if the wine bottle here is using ambient occlusion. It's not, so I don't have to worry about that one. I'm pretty sure that the glass, none of the glass materials are using ambient occlusion, and no, they're not. Ceramic tiles, let's check that out. It's not using ambient occlusion. I believe the grout in between the tiles, however, is using ambient occlusion. Okay, so I'll just up that to 32 tops. Won't go higher than that. Okay, and the walls are already set up. All this stuff looks like it's pretty much set up. And I believe this light fixture up here is not using ambient occlusion, and it's not. So I have very few materials actually in total that are using the ambient occlusion shader, which is good because the less you have, the faster render is going to be. Now, next thing I'm going to do is take these lights. I'll hit Control A to open up the attribute editor. Make sure you go down to the mental ray settings, okay? And we can see down here that our high samples are set to 8. We should probably increase that. So let's go ahead and increase that to about 16, which will help out greatly here for our render quality. I'm going to select this one over here and up that one to 16 as well for the high samples. Okay, let me close that. And I almost forgot another light up here. The light here for the ceiling fixture. So let's open up the attribute editor there. Double the high samples to 16. Let's go back to the bookmark here for render 1. Let's open up the render view window and let's save this image here. Let's render this image again, see what we get. Okay, so the render actually went by a little bit faster because we had a little bit less artifacting, and I know that doesn't make any sense, but the more artifacting you have, the more anti-aliasing is required because it's a high contrast image. So in this case, our render time actually decreased by a second and the quality improved by a little bit. So this is the before and this is the after. We can see it in the after we got rid of a lot of the graininess that was here with this white counter material. Also the floor lost a lot of artifacting. The walls barely lost any artifacting. They still look almost the same. Here's what I'm going to do. Let me close that. I'm going to up the high samples on these area lights here. So let me select these area lights. Let me double that to 32. Oops, not 232. That's pretty crazy. Just select this light here. Go to 32. Select this light over here. And put it to 32 as well. Okay, let's go back to our bookmark. Open up the render view. Save this image. And let's render out again. Okay, so our render time went back up by 1 second. You can see a lot of the artifacting that was on the floor is now gone. This is before, here's after. So the area lights can produce a lot of artifacting, and that's why we have to increase those high samples up to pretty high amounts to get rid of a lot of those artifacts. So you can see here's the before. Here's the before. The floor was improved quite a bit. And the walls, although they did change a little bit and they lost a little bit of artifacting, they still have a lot of artifacting on there. Okay, so at this point, the area lights are fixed up. They're no longer producing the artifacting that's going to kill the scene. Right now, the problem with the scene is the ambient occlusion effect. So there's a couple of things that we can do. We can increase the amount. If we go back to the material attributes for the walls here, we can increase the amount of samples on the walls to 256. That's going to increase render time by quite a bit, however, and I really don't want to do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is go to the render settings, and I'll go to quality here, and under the anti-aliasing settings, I have to increase it because right now I'm using preview settings. I'm using minimum sample of -2 and a max of 0, so I have to increase that. So let me just increase that to 3 and 1. 3 and 1 actually works pretty good. And I'll switch my multi-pixel filter here to a Mitchell filter, which will work out pretty well. And everything else looks pretty good. Okay, my anti-aliasing contrast is fine. I'm not going to worry about that too much. And everything else looks pretty good. Now let me close that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to options, I'm going to go to test resolution, and I'm going to tell this thing to render out at my render settings, which is 640 by 480 pixels. Right now it's set to 75% of that, which is smaller. So if I do a snapshot here, you can see it, the render is much larger now. Okay. Alright. So I'm going to hit render, and this render is going to take quite a few minutes to do. And I'm just going to go ahead and render it out and skip ahead in the video so you don't have to see it. And you can render this out yourself if you want on your own free time and see what you end up with. Okay, so the render for me took about 12 minutes and change. Looks pretty nice. The only part that I'm not too happy about is there is a little bit of artifacting on this wall right here. Okay, and that's happening because the ambient occlusion feature of the shader is having to sample out up to 150 units out. So if we open up the material attributes for that, this is what's causing that distance of 150. If we reduce that distance, we'll get rid of most, if not all, of that artifacting, but the scene will become a little bit darker. So it's a little bit of give and take. What I recommend doing is probably increasing the amount of samples here past 128, which you can do. So if you want to, you could go to 256, which is double the amount, and that'll actually get rid of a lot of that artifacting, if not all of it altogether. Okay, so but I'll leave you to that to render that on your own time. I'm not going to go ahead and render that out now. So there you go. That's how to use the architectural shader to do all kinds of cool things, including imitate global illumination and final gathering through color bleeding. We saw how to do physically correct glass, especially when you combine glass with liquids and things. In this case, the example of the wine glass and the wine inside the glass. We also got to see how different things work. So you can make things look like ceramic materials, wooden materials, metallic materials, things like that. And we even got to look at brush metals using anisotropic reflections. One other thing that I want to show you, though, that I didn't show you early on, mainly because I wanted you to learn how to control these shaders manually from scratch, is let's go ahead and let's open up the material attributes here for this wall material. Okay. In the attribute editor, you'll notice that there's this presets button here. And if we go ahead and left mouse button click on that and hold down the left mouse button, you open up this sort of secret menu over here. And this menu has a whole bunch of different presets already for you. Presets for doing stuff like chrome, copper, frosted glass, glass physical, thick glass, thin glass, solid glass, glazed ceramic materials, pearls, pearl finish materials, rubber, satin metal, so on and so forth, even water. So you can actually go ahead and use these presets here to get you kick-started so that you can be on your way to creating whatever materials you need. So there isn't a preset for every single material that exists in the real world, and that's why I didn't show you these presets before, because when you see the presets, you'll be enticed to go ahead and sort of cheat and use these presets as a sort of way to cut corners and things, which is actually good. It's not a bad thing to cut corners as much as possible when working in CGI. But it's always good to know how to do things from scratch yourself. So if in a worst case scenario, for example here, you see that there is no preset for doing any type of wood, so you would be stuck. But since you learned how to do wood from scratch in this chapter, in this tutorial, that wouldn't be a problem for you. So there you go. So that's going to do it for this chapter on using the architectural shader with the hypershade in Maya and Mental Ray. I'm going to end this here, and I'll see you in the next chapter.